Good evening, everyone. And here we are. Welcome to Assembly Ways and Means and Senate Finance at dusk. With that, I will ask the Secretary to please call the roll.
Senator Brooks.
Here.
Senator Canizaro. Senator Dennis. Here. Senator Dondero Loop. Here. Senator Goycochea. Here. Senator Hammond. Here. Senator Kekeffer. Here. Senator Ratty. Here. Senator Severs-Gansert. Assemblywoman Benitez Thompson. Here. Assemblyman Frierson. Here. Assemblywoman Gorlow. Here. Assemblyman Hafen. Here. Assemblywoman Howdigi. Here. Assemblyman Levitt. Here. Assemblywoman Miller. Here. Assemblywoman Monroe Moreno. Here. Assemblywoman Peters. Here. Assemblyman Roberts. Here. Assemblywoman Titus. Here. Assemblywoman Tolles. Here. Assemblyman Watts. Here. Chair Carlton.
And I am here. Thank you very much. So with that, this evening we have one item on our agenda this evening, which is the joint closing subcommittee report on K through 12 education. Just so that everyone is on the same page this evening, we will be going through the document this evening. This is not the last conversation about education that we are going to have. Chair Brooks and I plan on scheduling another joint meeting tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. to have further conversation, but we need to have this conversation this evening, which allows us to get the data points together to have a future conversation tomorrow morning. So with that, Assembly Education upon the adjournment of the joint meeting, Assembly Ways and Means and Senate Education will come together then. So this is the time of session where we just have to kind of roll with the punches, and this is one of them. So with that, I will ask staff to go ahead and share the document. It is a large document, but it's the top 20 pages, which are the pages that we will be discussing. All the document in the back is all backup documents that committee members and members of the public who've been participating would have seen before in other iterations in other committee meetings. So with that, I'm asking the staff to share the document. We will take a brief moment, not a recess, just a pause for those who are working remotely in order to print the document. But as I said, it's the top 20 pages you need. So don't worry about that 185 pages that are coming at you. So let me check with the Department of Education that is working remotely. Have you been able to access the document? We want to make sure that you have everything that you need.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for checking. We do not have access to the document quite yet.
If there's an issue, please let us know. We'll give it another moment for it to show up to you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We have the first 20 pages.
I think that'll get you where you need to go. Thank you very much, Superintendent. So with that, committee members, I believe we can begin. We have Ms. Waller remotely, I believe. Good evening.
Good, good evening. For the record, J. Marie Mangoba from the Fiscal Analysis Division. And with me tonight is Ms. Julie Waller. And Ms. Julie Waller and I will be presenting the Joint Subcommittee on K-12 Higher Education CIP Closing Report for the K-12 Education. The Joint Subcommittee on K-12 Higher Education CIP has completed its review of certain budgets for K-12 education, which include the State Education Funding Account, new Nevada Education Funding Plan, Instruction in Financial Literacy, Distributive School Account, other state education programs, professional development programs, School Remediation Trust Fund, School Safety, State Supplemental School Support Account, Teach Nevada Scholarship Program, Incentives for Licensed Education Personnel, Contingency Account for Special Education Services, and Bullying Prevention Account. The subcommittee recommendations result in a decrease of general fund appropriations totaling $781,637 in each year of the 2021-23 biennium. And the following highlights the more significant closing recommendations of the subcommittee. For the State Education Funding Account, Budget Account 2609, the subcommittee recommended approval of the full implementation of the pupil-centered funding plan in the 2021-23 biennium, which would provide state as well as certain local revenue earmarked for K-12 education through the plan. The subcommittee also approved the updated projections for the non-general fund revenue sources for the State Education Fund, reflecting all revenue revisions directly in the fund, revising NRS 387.1212 to only allow interest to be earned on non-general fund revenue in the fund, and legislation that will require both registration revenue to be deposited in the fund beginning in fiscal year 22. Nevada Revised Statutes 387.121 indicates the legislative intent that no school district receive less money under the pupil-centered funding plan than the school district received in fiscal year 20. The subcommittee recommended to expand the hold harmless provision to include charter schools and university schools for profoundly gifted pupils, but not applying inflationary increases to the hold harmless amounts. The subcommittee also recommended applying the hold harmless amount on a per pupil basis based on the amount of fiscal year 20 revenue received or awarded to each school district and charter school, which would account for changes in enrollment over the 2021-23 biennium. The subcommittee also directed fiscal staff to calculate the additional general fund appropriations needed in fiscal year 22 to bring the funding level up to the fiscal year 20 funding level for the pupil-centered funding plan based on the final recommendations of the subcommittee. Fiscal staff estimates the total fiscal year 20 funding level will be $67.2 million greater than the total projected revenue in fiscal year 22 needed to balance the pupil-centered funding plan. However, fiscal staff estimates no additional general fund appropriations will be necessary to meet the fiscal year 20 funding level amount in fiscal year 23 based on the projected revenue. These amounts include the governor's recommendation to transfer the Instruction in Financial Literacy program funding to the State Education Funding Account, which will be discussed later in this closing document. So decision for the money committees tonight is, do the money committees wish to appropriate general funds of $67.2 million in fiscal year 22 to bring the funding level up to the fiscal year 20 funding level for the pupil-centered funding plan?
Thank you, Ms. Mangoba, and there's a number of decision points here, so we're going to stop at each one and make sure that those members that were not on the Education Subcommittee have an opportunity to make sure that they understand the conversation points that the subcommittee went through numerous times. So with that, I would go ahead and open it up to any questions or comments from any committee members at this time. Ms. Miller.
Thank you, Chair. My question isn't necessarily on the actual decision point as it is on some of the language before that. So it's my understanding the 67.2 million will bring the districts up to where they were so that no district's receiving less than they did in the 2020 school year. But when it says that there's no need in the 2022 year to balance, is that because of a different formula will be used or different projections? Is it saying that the district should expect less in 2022?
For the record, Jean Marie Mandoba, the reason why fiscal year 23 is not projected to require additional funding is because the projected revenues in fiscal year 23 came in higher than the fiscal year 20 funding level.
So, Ms. Miller, it goes back to the fact that in 2022, we don't have a lot of money, but in 2023, the projections are much higher. So it's up to us to make up that difference in the first year of the biennium, but we know what those projections are for the second year of the biennium, so there would not be an impact to the general fund in that second year.
Thank you.
I know it reads a little backwards, so I'm glad you asked the question. We were able to get it on the record. Are there other questions from the committee members at this time? Not seeing any. So committee members, the decision point before us is to appropriate general funds of $67.2 million to bring the funding level up to the 2020 funding level for the pupil-centered funding plan. It was never, I believe, anyone's intent to have anyone go backwards through this whole process. So, Senator Brooks.
Yes, I'd be prepared to make a motion, but I just want to make sure that it's crystal clear that the $67.2 million in FY 2022 is to bring, to create the baseline for the per pupil based upon the 2020 levels that were agreed upon in the 2019 legislature. And so this 67.2 is not all the money that will be added. This is what's necessary to create the baseline to get the pupil-centered funding plan at the 2020 hold harmless level, by which we will make all other decisions upon that.
And thank you, Senator. This is the first domino that needs to fall for all the other dominoes to follow so that we can get to the end. Okay. Any other questions or comments? Seeing none, Senator Brooks.
Thank you, Chair Carlton. I move that the committee appropriate general funds of $67.2 million in fiscal year 2022 to bring the funding level up to the fiscal year 2020 funding level for the pupil-centered funding plan.
I have a motion from Senator Brooks.
I'll
a
second the motion.
From Vice Chair Monroe Moreno. Any questions or comments on the motion? Hearing none, all those in favor, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Any in opposition? Hearing no opposition, passes unanimously of all those members present. Ms. Mangoba, if you'd like to proceed, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The subcommittee recommended budgeting for transportation and food services costs or auxiliary services in the pupil-centered funding plan based on a 4-year average of actual expenditures, providing this funding to school districts on a monthly basis based on the annual budgeted amount and not applying an inflationary increase to the annual budgeted cost for transportation. The subcommittee recommended approval of the Department of Education's calculation of the average statewide base per pupil amount of $6,954 in fiscal year 22 and $7,090 in fiscal year 23, which will be used to establish the pupil-centered funding plan for the 2021-23 biennium. The subcommittee deferred making recommendations on the following items related to the pupil-centered funding plan: the revised Nevada Cost of Education Index that reflects updated regional price parities index data and the distribution based on the funding that will be provided through the pupil-centered funding plan, the utilization of a floor of 1.0 for the Nevada Cost of Education Index for those counties with an index that came below 1.0 in the 2021-23 biennium, and the attendance area size adjustment developed by the subject matter experts and recommended by the Commission on School Funding and the Governor that would be used instead of the small district and necessarily small schools adjustments. When deferring recommendations on these items, the subcommittee requested fiscal staff provide funding model results that reflect the following two scenarios, which can be found as attachments in the closing package, and that will be on page 21 to 25 of the package. A is reflecting the updated Nevada Cost of Education Index, utilizing a floor of 1.0 for those counties with an index below 1.0 in the 2021-23 biennium. And B is reflecting a Nevada Cost of Education Index of 1.0 for all counties, which would effectively eliminate the use of the index as a cost adjustment factor. And I would just note that on page 25, you'll see the summary that compares the change in total funding as well as the average per pupil funding on a per pupil basis between these two scenarios. And so the decision points for the money committees for tonight is, do the money committees wish to approve the attendance area size adjustment developed by the subject matter experts and recommended by the Commission on School Funding and the governor that will be used instead of both the small district and necessarily small schools adjustments, and the revised Nevada Cost of Index that reflects updated regional price parities index data and the distribution based on the funding that will be provided through the pupil-centered funding plan? And if so, the money committees will need to consider the following options for the application of the index. Option A is to utilize a floor of 1.0 for the updated Nevada Cost of Education Index for those counties with an index that went below 1.0 for the 2021-23 biennium, as recommended by the governor and the School Commission on School Funding. Or B is reflect a Nevada Cost of Index of 1.0 for all counties, which would effectively eliminate the use of the index as a cost adjustment factor for the 2021-23 biennium. And Madam Chair, we'll be happy to answer any questions you may have.
And thank you very much, Ms. Mangoba. So let's go ahead and go to the first decision point, and trying to make sure that we address this as far as it impacts the charters. If you could elaborate on that for us, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is Julie Waller for the record. As you may recall, SB 543 did not include the charter schools in the in the small district equity adjustment, necessarily small schools equity adjustment. Charter schools were included in the Nevada Cost of Education Index. However, as we have run through the model and have listened to feedback from stakeholders, it appears that in order to treat every public school the same, the subcommittee might wish to consider adding the charter schools to be included in the computation of the small area attendance adjustment. And in particular, I would call out that there are some charter schools located in rural school districts, such as in Elko and Ely, and Fallon and Carson City, and they would receive a different basic support or adjusted base per pupil amount because they are not receiving that attendance area adjustment. They would be receiving the Nevada Cost of Education Index adjustment. However, that would create a disparity between a student basic support a per pupil amount between a student that attended a school district school in Ely versus a student that attended a charter school in Ely. So in order to align that and create parity between the charter schools and in the rural school districts, along with the school districts in the rural school districts that receive consideration and equity adjustment factor, the subcommittee may wish to consider whether or not to include those charter schools in that adjustment factor, as well as the already existing adjustment factor, the Nevada Cost of Education Index.
Thank you very much, Ms. Waller. So with that, I'd like to open it up for conversation from the committee on that particular point. As far as including the charters, I'll go to Majority Leader. Oh, that's another issue. Okay. So I'm on the first issue, Senator Severs-Gansert.
Thank you, Chair Carlton. And so I don't know what the calculation is between, in my mind, there's a couple scenarios. One is if you have a charter school in Clark County, you make sure they match up to the dollars, including the small area enrollment dollar for that county. Or it sounds like you're suggesting you created a district out of all the charters consolidated. So it doesn't really matter where they're located. If they would have their own small district or small enrollment area. Is that what you're suggesting?
Thank you, Madam Chair, through you, Senator. The idea is that the allowing the charter schools to be included in the attendance area adjustment factor for the equity adjustment factor. It's based on location. So if you have a school that's located in Ely or White Pine County, then they would receive the same equity adjustment that a school district school located in White Pine County would receive, and likewise for Clark or Washoe, if they were eligible for attendance area adjustment.
Thank you. That's kind of what I had in my head. So the last example that I remember, I think Clark County was $67 per student. So if you were a charter school in Clark County, the adjustment would be, if the numbers stay the same, which they may move, $67 a student.
Thank you again, Madam Chair, Senator Severs-Gansert. It depends on the attendance area. The attendance area is based on centralization of a school and how the distance from schools apart. And so, in Las Vegas, certain areas of Las Vegas, there is no attendance area adjustment because they're all centralized. So there's no additional cost for them to operate their schools in that close vicinity. However, there are several attendance areas in the Clark County region, let's say like Laughlin and such. So those areas might receive some equity adjustment for their attendance areas because of their distance from, the urbanization. And so it's not necessarily because you're in Clark County, you're automatically getting an attendance area adjustment. It depends on your particular attendance area within Clark County.
Thank you. Do you mind if I ask just one follow-up? So thank you. So I had asked for the spreadsheets, and those were sent to me. And I did see how it wasn't not all the schools had enrollment area. But then at the end, basically, you had the small enrollment area for particular schools within a school district. But then they were summed up and divided by the denominator of all the students in Clark County. So when we put money into that small area enrollment, does it in fact, in the case of school district, does the check sort of be written, is that written to the entire school district, not to those schools? And so in the case of charters, would the schools, if they were part of a small school enrollment area, get funds directly, or would that money potentially be redistributed again? So again, like Clark County, did the dollars go to the schools that were identified, or does that check get written to the entire school district, and then it's up to the school district to decide whether to send that money to those schools?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yes, you are correct, Senator Severs-Gansert. In the spreadsheet that you're referencing, they do sum up all of the attendance areas, the various attendance areas within Clark County, and provide an average, to show an average attendance area adjustment for all of those various areas. Those, it's a weighted factor that gets calculated into the base per pupil adjustment for Clark County School District. They would receive that for the number of students in all of those various attendance areas. And I believe that SB 543 doesn't contemplate that the school district would provide additional funding to those outlying attendance areas. As far as the charter schools, they would be, depending on where they are located, so if you had a charter school located within the Las Vegas attendance area, they would get that specific dollar amount identified for that attendance area, for which in Las Vegas itself, because that's the urban core, the centralized area of doing business, there is no small district attendance area adjustment. So we will basically, what we would do if this were to move forward would look at where all the charters are located, and they would get the same attendance area adjustment for those within those counties. And then those would be distributed in their per pupil amount to those individual charter schools.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Senator Gokachia?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think I got a lot of that there. I was concerned about how they were going to, even though my schools like in Sandy Valley and Moapa, how they were going to get this, they're definitely, it costs more in the rural area to educate them. This Sandy Valley, especially isolated. And I just wanted to make sure that whether they were going to get the money, they can't get it directly. It would have to come through the school district. And I'm just trying to figure out which of these formulas would be best. Just struggling with it, a lot of information quickly. But I think a lot of that got answered what I needed.
And thank you, Senator Gokachia. And one of the conversation points was in multiple different iterations that we've had is as we started looking at how those dominoes fell and how they impacted charters, what was the best way to be able to make sure that charters were included, because it was all over the board. So by actually grouping them all together and treating them like a small area or a small district, that would allow them to aggregate it out and smooth it across all charters so that there aren't roller coasters, big hills and big valleys because of the way they've been funded differently across the formula. So this would allow that smoothing effect to actually happen. And I'm no fiscal person, but that's how I put it in my brain so that I would understand how we could mitigate some of the adverse impacts that could possibly happen depending upon which toggle on that model you pulled. Assemblywoman Tolles.
Thank you, Chair, and I appreciate that. We're definitely considering the geographical impact on these smaller charter schools in smaller areas, and I think that I do support that we need to adjust that. I'm curious, though, because charter schools operate a little differently than the school district. So, for example, we have a charter school that's a Washoe County charter school, and then we have Nevada charter schools, and then we have different management companies behind them. So how does that functionally work?
Ms. Waller, it's phone a friend time.
Thank you, Madam Chair. If I understand the question correctly, are you referring to if the attendance area adjustment were available to the charter schools? How would that work? Again, it's by individual charter school. You're going to the model will look at where is that charter school located, and then add that if they're eligible for that attendance area adjustment, they would get the attendance area adjustment for that county in which that particular charter school is located. That adds into their adjusted base per pupil dollar amount that, based on their enrollment, would then be distributed to that individual charter school wherever they are located.
Thank you, Chair. If I can clarify what I heard, I think there's a little bit of confusion between this lumping together versus each individual charter school. And maybe I'm jumping ahead because I'm looking on page 10 where it talks about that model, so I can hold off. But what I'm hearing you say is that a charter school in a county in a smaller geographical population area would get an adjustment for that specific charter school that is equitable to a similar public school that would get an adjustment in that county in that same geographical area. So there's equity in pairing there. Thank you.
That's correct.
That's my understanding, yes. And going to, I'm sorry? Ms. Miller?
Thank you, Chair. And going off of what my fellow Assemblywoman was asking, I think what will clarify it for me even further is when we're saying charter school, are we speaking of that physical individual building? Or are we referring to the management company or the group of charter schools under one umbrella? So if we have one management company that manages 4 or 5 charter schools throughout the county, that's what we see often in Clark County, is that there may be one management company and those buildings are spread throughout the county. So is that counting as one individual charter school? Or are we talking about each physical separate building?
For the record, Jamie Mangoba, it is going to be based on their charter contract, not by charter campuses. So although they have 5 campuses with that one charter contract, it will be based on that charter contract.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ms. Mangoba. Senator Hammond.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So now I've got a question, because the way I understood it, you were talking about individual schools just a second ago, and there are some management companies who have different charter schools located in different attendance zones. One, for example, down in Las Vegas, and one up here in Washoe County. So the way I thought you were explaining it at first was that it would be separated by school depending on the attendance zone, completely agnostic to who the LEA was, because in some cases, and I think this might have been mentioned earlier by Assemblywoman Tolles, that some schools located in Las Vegas, their LEA is the charter authority, and some schools located in Las Vegas are their school the CCSD is their LEA. So maybe I need to understand that a little bit better, because I thought it was individual schools, no matter how many schools might be in a management company.
Based on where they're located.
Well, but the payment is based on the school, right, where they're located. We don't care about like who the management company is. Yeah, that's what you say. You like that? Thank you, Madam Chair. Julie Waller for the record. So, in our model, we have every charter school identified, single charter school, irrespective of who their management company might be. We do know who their sponsor is, which is, a school district or the State Public Charter School Authority. Charter schools are only separated out by the State Public Charter School Authority. Any charter school that's sponsored by the school district, they receive their funds from the school district. So they would already, if they're located in an area of Clark, they would receive whatever the Clark funding, the per pupil funding is. So in terms of the payment of the per pupil funding to a charter school in Northern Nevada or Southern Nevada or in a rural school district, the payment is made to the individual charter school. And again, we're not privy to necessarily considering who their educational management organization is. But those funds would be directed to that school. So we're not considering 5 schools that are managed by one company as just one company. Each school, wherever they're located, is going to receive an adjustment if there is an eligible adjustment to be received. Because some attendance areas do not receive adjustments if they are located in an urban setting.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. Waller. With that, any other questions on this particular item from any committee members? Not seeing any, we'll go ahead and move on to the next discussion point, and then when we're done, we'll take one motion on all of them. So would you like to go ahead and go over the next discussion point, please?
Madam Chair,
Oh, I apologize. We've already been through that. We just need to have conversation about it. I apologize. So with that, the next discussion point is the cost of education index and how that would actually affect the pupil-centered funding plan. And the committee has 2 options before them. I believe Ms. Benitez Thompson had wanted to make some comments on that, and then we'll have further conversation on whether how we'll approach this cost of education index.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I appreciate that. And so throughout the course of the conversations on this, the indexing and the data used to go into those indexing was a real hot topic of conversation, especially as the data and the numbers landed. So I don't think there's been a moment where, much to my committee members' dismay, I haven't talked about this. So I would say that I would not be supportive of B for the reason that I asked for B, because what we were trying to do is see if moving certain data points in the model made a difference or not. And really, it didn't. So in our subcommittee hearings, the data that we looked at was reflected from 2017. The data that's being used for our closing is 2019. Had a good conversation with different folks about the Nevada Cost of Education Index, and there's two big pieces to it, right? There's cost of goods and services, and then there's wages. And each one of those have a balancing percentage in composites. And really what it came down to, and the work that we know has to continue at the commission, is the search for more Nevada-specific data, and they're going to begin that conversation this summer. And so knowing that it will be a continued conversation to make sure we have better data that's collected in Nevada and reflected in Nevada, it will, I think, look more like what we experience at the street level, right? Because that was my big hangup living in Washoe, was how can you tell me that the cost of services and indexes are only a 0.01 difference from some of the rural counties. And so we looked at even adjusting the rent index within that, thinking that that would move it, but because it was 2017 levels and not 2021 levels, it didn't make as much as a difference, but it did reflect more of what we saw in 2017. And there's always a lag in this kind of stuff. So I would recommend A, because A is kind of the best fit for where we need to be with this. And so I hope no one thinks that we didn't look at this 100 different ways, because we really did. And A is where we're going to land. We ought to land, I should say. Thank you.
And thank you, Ms. Benitez Thompson. And thank you for asking the question. In the subcommittee, it's always good to be able to have those comparisons to see really how does this actually work. And I know we had a number of concerns about it, so being able to actually have that analysis and have it come back at the full committee closing so that we could make the decision based on that data point is very helpful. Senator Kiekefer, did you have a comment? I'm sure you did.
I have a question, Madam Chair. I appreciate it, and perhaps the majority leader answered it. The way the data was presented in the subcommittee showed significantly greater deviation from application of the cost index versus what I think I was probably expecting if we applied a 1.0 floor to everybody, so effectively making everybody equally applied. So I think that you said, Teresa, that it was updated data. Is that what's driving the difference?
Thank you so much for the question, Senator Kiekefer. So a piece of it was updated data. So looking at the time the commission was working on the most relevant data was 2017. And then we're looking at, and staff can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think 2019 is reflected here. But knowing that these are regional indexes that they're using, kind of larger West Coast regional indexes, and knowing that the commission starting in the summer are going to start looking at data that's better generated within Nevada that might better reflect our unique nature of our state of having very rural areas and then very urban areas. And so I think we're going to get to a better spot in this conversation than also the acknowledgement of just the time lag, where we're living on the streets looking at 2021 house prices, for example, but the data's got a 2-year lag on it. So, and then the data we were first presented was a 4-year lag. So if we look back through it at, a 2-year look back at that lens, it is more reflective than what I think we feel right now. But inherently, we just have to wait for that to catch up, because we don't have data that's reflective of, in any conversation, this given point in time right now.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you, Majority Leader. The North has spoken With that, are there any other questions on that? I believe Ms. Benitez Thompson is guiding the committee towards a conversation around choice A, which I concur with. I believe that's where the subcommittee was originally headed until we decided we needed some more information. So I concur with that. Are there any other questions from any other committee members at this time on this issue? Seeing none, then Senator Brooks.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I move that the committee approve the attendance area size adjustment developed by the subject matter experts and recommended by the Commission on School Funding and the Governor that would be used instead of both the small district and necessarily small district adjustments. Adding charters, as described by staff and how they would be treated as a group like a district. And that the revised Nevada Cost of Education Index that reflects updated regional price parities index data and the distribution based on the funding that would be provided through the Pupil Center funding plan. And also move to utilize option A, to utilize a floor of 1.0 for the updated Nevada Cost of Education Index for those counties with an index below 1.0 for the 21-23 biennium, as recommended by the Commission on School Funding and the Governor.
And I will second the motion.
Thank you. I have a motion by Senator Brooks, a second by Vice Chair Monroe Moreno. Any questions or comments on the motion? Seeing none, all those in favor, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Any in opposition? Hearing no opposition, passes unanimously of the members present. Ms. Mangoba, we can proceed.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Continuing on page 5, regarding enrollment and pupil counts, the subcommittee recommended approval of the governor's recommended enrollment projections for fiscal year 22 and fiscal year 23. The subcommittee also recommended the inclusion of a back language in the K-12 education funding bill to temporarily revise the provisions of NRS 387.1223 for fiscal year 22 to allow school districts and charter schools to base the enrollment comparison on a 2-year period. Also, the use of audited October 1 enrollment counts to determine the weighted funding that will be allocated to pupils in the following fiscal year. The use of eligibility for free or reduced price lunch to identify at-risk students in the 2021-23 biennium, and the use of a 0.12 weight for the gifted and talented education program as recommended in the executive budget. Nevada Revised Statute 387.1213 establishes the Education Stabilization Account that would provide funding to the Department of Education for distribution to school districts and charter schools when the Interim Finance Committee determines the State Education Fund will receive 97% or less its projected revenue in a fiscal year. Since this account would not have any funding when the pupil-centered funding plan is initially implemented, the subcommittee recommended providing the Education Stabilization Account with a loan of $50 million from the general fund. This loan would be repaid from the Education Stabilization Account in annual installments equal to the future amounts that are transferred into the account. However, the subcommittee deferred making a recommendation regarding the effective date of this general fund appropriations to the Education Stabilization Account. Do the money committees wish to appropriate general funds of $50 million as a loan to the Education Stabilization Account in fiscal year 21 or in fiscal year 22? In addition, do the money committees wish to recommend language be included in the K-12 education funding bill that would provide this general fund appropriation to the Education Stabilization Account, which would be repaid in annual installments equal to future accounts that are transferred into the account? And Madam Chair, we'll be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, Ms. Mangoba. This was a discussion point in the subcommittee. We weren't quite sure what year. We did come to consensus on the amount and that it would be a loan and that it would be repaid as money would trip into the stabilization account. It would always stay at 50 million. Anything extra that would go in would come back to repay the loan, and once the loan is repaid off, then the money would constantly just drip into the stabilization account along the lines of the same theory as our rainy day fund. But the discussion point was, would it need to be 21 or 22? And I believe after the analysis that has been done, the committee, myself, I'm comfortable with booking it in 2021. We don't want to push it out too far. We don't want to put the school districts in an awkward position in the second year, so we want to make sure the resources are there for this to be able to succeed. So booking the $50 million in fiscal year 2021 seems to be the most reasonable choice at this time. So, committee members, are there any questions or comments on this particular item? Not seeing any. Assemblywoman Tolles.
Thank you so much, Chair, and forgive me because I'm not on the subcommittee, so I'm.
That's why we're here. Go for it. There you go.
So thank you. And it may be because of this loan repayment that this answers my question, but I see that we're taking $50 million from general funds, and I just wondered if the subcommittee had any discussions about all this federal fund money, if that's something
Oh, we have talked about it.
I figured you must have. I wondered if you could enlighten us just for our benefit on where that conversation went. Thank you.
There's a little bit of a difference of opinion, but the chair is concerned on spending money that I don't have in my hand yet. And Senator Brooks will tell you the other side of the opinion.
Well, no, I'm just really concerned about funding K through 12 education with whatever monies we possibly can get our hands on. But the stabilization account is like a rainy day account in that it doesn't necessarily have an end date when those dollars will be spent. They could theoretically, if all goes well, they would never get spent. And just like our rainy day fund for our state general fund, the guidance does not allow the ARP monies to be used in that fashion. It has to go towards something where the dollars will be spent, and they'll be spent in a certain way. So rainy day fund and the stabilization account, which is in essence a rainy day fund for the PCFP, are not allowable expenses.
Thank
And
you.
there's
I
also a
appreciate that.
time frame consideration also that they would need to be spent by a certain time. So, but thank you for asking the question.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
So with that, committee members, Senator Dennis.
Just so I'm clear, the decision is when we put the money in there, and we're saying 21, so immediately, because this was when we really need it.
Yes.
Right.
That is the decision point, and the subcommittee wanted to wait to make sure that we had a full understanding of each year and where we needed to be before we made that decision.
Right, thank you.
So with that, I don't see anything else, so I'll go to Senator Brooks.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I move to appropriate general funds of $50 million as a loan to the Education Stabilization Account in fiscal year 2021. In addition, I move to recommend language be included in the K-12 education funding bill that would provide this general fund appropriation to the Education Stabilization Account, which would be repaid in annual installments equal to future amounts that are transferred into the account.
I will second the motion.
Thank you very much. I have a motion from Senator Brooks, a second from Vice Chair Monroe Moreno. Any questions or comments on the motion? Seeing none. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Any in opposition? Hearing no opposition, passes unanimously of all members present. Ms. Mangoba, if you could proceed, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The subcommittee recommended the issuance of a letter of intent to the Department of Education requiring the department and the Commission on School Funding to study various topics over the 2021-22 interim, including to review the Nevada Cost of Education Index, including a plan and timeline to eliminate the floor of 1.0 for the Nevada Cost of Education Index, so the index may function as intended by redistributing funding contingent upon the Money Committee's action for the Nevada Cost of Education Index. A review and comparison of students identified as at risk based on eligibility for free or reduced price lunch and the revised methodology using data from the Infinite Campus system. This comparison should also consider the effect this change would have on the unduplicated counts for these students who may also belong to another weighted category. A review of high school dual enrollment programs and any recommendations for the funding provided to the school districts and charters with students who participate in those programs. A review of online schools operated by school districts to determine if the funding provided to full-time students at those schools should align with the funding provided to online charter schools, which only receive the statewide base per pupil funding amount, and a review of the funding provided for transportation and food services, and any recommendations for revisions to how this funding is budgeted and allocated. The department will provide a report detailing its findings to the Interim Finance Committee no later than August 31st, 2022. Regarding the post-closing, we are going to provide post-closing updates and new information for the money committees tonight. After the subcommittee closed the state education funding account on May 11, 2021, fiscal staff received new information regarding potential equity concerns, with including the local funding used by the school districts, charter schools, and university schools for profoundly gifted pupils for special education in the statewide base per pupil funding. The total local funding utilized by these entities for special education in fiscal year 20 was $445.1 million. To address the potential equity concerns, the money committees may wish to place this funding as a separate tier in the pupil-centered funding plan. Similar to the auxiliary services funding, local special education funding could be provided through a separate tier to school districts, charter schools, and university schools for profoundly gifted pupils on a monthly basis based on the annual budgeted amount. It should be noted, providing this local special education funding through a tier would reduce the statewide base per pupil funding amount previously approved by the subcommittee of $6,954 in fiscal year 22 to $6,627, inclusive of the additional funding of $67.2 million that is needed to meet the fiscal year 20 funding levels, and from $7,090 in fiscal year 23 to $6,651. However, the final numbers would be identified for approval in the K-12 education funding bill based on all final legislative action regarding K-12 education. And staff would just note that the statewide base per pupil amount does not include the cost adjustment factors such as the NCEI and the attendance area adjustment, as well as auxiliary and weights. And it is the starting point, but it does include the consumer price index or the inflation and projected enrollment growth. Do the money committees wish to include the local funding utilized by school district, charter schools, and university schools for profoundly gifted pupils for special education as a separate tier in the pupil-centered funding plan, which would reduce the statewide base per pupil funding in each year of the 2021-23 biennium, and allocate this funding back to each school district, charter school, and university schools for profoundly gifted pupils on a monthly basis based on the annual budgeted amount. And Madam Chair, we'll be happy to answer any questions you may have.
And thank you very much. And this did come up after subcommittee closing, so it is a new item. I want to make sure everyone's comfortable with it. So as I walk myself through it, we had always had a conversation about special education being in its own place. Now we have another component where special education at the district level is also involved in this conversation. So by those dollars were originally included in the base as the per pupil, but now knowing that they are special education dollars, the color of those dollars have changed, and the maintenance of effort that is required to go along with those dollars, those need to be separated out so that they can legally be distributed in the appropriate way. We would not be wanting to spend special education dollars through the base funding that would not be going to special education students, so we're going to separate that out. It will lower the base, but those dollars are just being moved and then sent back to the students that those dollars would have originally supported. Do I have that pretty close, Ms. Mangoba?
Madam Chair, that is correct. This would also, there's vast variation between school districts and charter schools on the amount of funding they provide for special education. So this would maintain that equity and will not be diluted by placing those funds in a statewide base per pupil amount.
Madam Chair, if I might.
And so I just want to make sure with Ms. Mangoba, so the money that is going to special education students will go to special education students. I think that needs to be very clear and on the record.
That is correct, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Ms. Mangoba. Ms. Waller.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I just wanted to provide additional information. Again, you absolutely, everything you said is correct, that these dollars have been identified as dollars that the school districts and charter schools transferred out of their general fund to support their local contribution for special education services. And by allowing that funding to be pulled apart and identified as local funding for special education services, those dollars will be returned to the school districts and charter schools. They will receive those dollars in their general fund. They would then transfer those to their special education fund to support the local contribution for the special education services. In addition, what we don't see in this pupil-centered funding model is a state contribution for special education services. That is in a separate budget account, and that is to identify the state's maintenance of effort. The decision regarding the local maintenance of effort, that is a local decision in terms of the services that they need to provide. So we will return those dollars that have been identified as supporting special education students, and then the districts will continue to use those for those students. And then one of the main concerns about leaving those in the base and running it through the model is that they would then be processed through the equity adjustments. And again, with the wide variations of dollars that are spent on local dollars that are spent on special education, that could result in winners and losers in terms of the equity adjustments that are run through the base per pupil.
Thank you, Ms. Waller. Senator Brooks.
Thank you. And I just want to clarify that while we are redirecting the way this goes, mainly for the purposes of transparency and accountability, it's the same amount of money. And that is, we're not talking about less money. We're just redirecting it so that there's more clarity and transparency when you look at it. And so I'll refer back to page 21, our attachment. And please correct me if I'm wrong. This is the money that's in the table. I guess it would be tab 2.1.1, special ed local funding. This is the amount that we're talking about that we're discussing in this decision right here. Is that correct? That's the 430. Put my glasses on. $438.1 million.
That is correct, Senator. That is the total funding that will be provided for the local portion of the special education services.
And so that's part of the $8,667 per pupil in total education spending in using the 2020 model. Is that correct as well?
Yes, that is correct in terms of what is being funded out of the state education fund. There are additional K-12 dollars that will be distributed out of different budget accounts, such as the state special education funding, as well as other categorical grants, such as career and technical education, that will add to this average spending by per pupil that will be reflected in the K-12 funding bill.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you for that clarification.
And with that, Senator Hammond, did you have a question?
I did, Madam Chair, and I'm grateful for, I think, the line of questioning that we got from Senator Brooks. I guess the only thing I think I understand that we're talking about taking out $438 million, and I get the per pupil is $8,667. I think after you take that out. what I don't know is, what's the difference if you left it in? And I don't know if we really need to know that. I think it's just more of a curiosity thing to kind of see where we would have been. Because again, I understand that the money goes back into education. It goes back into those schools. So we're not losing those dollars. I just wanted to see what it looks like. I think sometimes we're always looking, we're concentrating so much on what the per pupil look is. And so I just wanted to see what the difference is between leaving it all in there and what the per pupil funding would be. And once you take it out, what does it look like? Does that make sense?
Senator Hammond, if you're asking for another computation with the way this model works, we will be here until next week.
Well, I
And
don't
I understand.
want to be here till next week, so I guess I don't want to know that, but I just want to know if there was if somebody could say, hey, it's a difference of $300 per pupil or something.
Well, I think at the top of page 9, you get an idea of what those dollars would have looked like before, and I'll hand it back over to Ms. Waller, but I think the ultimate conversation point these are special education dollars, and we need to make sure that those special education dollars get to special education students. And if you put them in the base, they will be diluted and spread across all students rather than going back to those particular students. So I think that's the major conversation point. And what happened after the subcommittee closed was there were not only state special education dollars, but there's local special education dollars, which we needed to corral off, as you would, to make sure that those dollars are well accounted for. They come in and they go back out right where they need to be. So yes, it does, in essence, it has the perception of lowering the base because those dollars originally in the conversations, we did not know we had to cordon those particular dollars from the locals off. They were not identified as special education dollars. Once they were identified as special education dollars, we had a responsibility to set them off to the side to make sure that they got to the right students. So therefore, you see the change in the base.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think that helps out. And if you are right, and it's top of page 9, I think that answers my questions. And sometimes belaboring the point is actually good in this case because that is the focus of so many people on how much we spend per pupil, and to let them know that the money is still there. It's being spent where it's supposed to be spent in special education. It's still going to those students who need it most. I think is important to do. But I think that you just answered the question. If those numbers at the top of page 9, what I was looking at, and there's 2 sets of numbers, but I'll ask. I think that you're talking about the difference between the 6,994, or yes, 6,954 and 6,627.
And then there's the next set of numbers on line 3.
Yeah. Thank you.
And you're very welcome, Senator Hammond. And also keep in mind that the actual K-12 funding bill, that first page delineates every single thing in a line. And then there's that total number at the bottom that shows all dollars that are going to every single student in the state. So it is broken down by components there. So we have to make sure that we account for each one of those in each one of those lines. So when we do get to the K-12 funding bill, a lot of this will translate over to that, and that'll be on that first page. So it makes it very clear to everyone what the state investment in education is. Senator Kiekefer, did you still have a question?
I do, Madam Chair. Thank you. Ms. Bengoba, are the dollar figures associated with each district out of their 387 reports, or where did we land on those numbers?
Senator, these are numbers from the NRS 387 report based on the actual expenditures for fiscal year 20.
Okay, so there are some districts that are at their 13% cap for state support for special ed, and if they're already there and they get more students, some of their local expenditures for special ed are going to grow year over year. So is this going to be a calculation that's done sort of every biennium when we go through to calculate the base amount in the even numbered year for special ed based on direct reports that we get back from the district, or is this going to be sort of like a baseline that goes into the formula and stays there and then is multiplied out?
Senator, to your question, it will be based on their actual expenditure. So for this particular one, it's based on fiscal year 20. When we move to the next biennium, it will be based on their fiscal year 22 actual expenditures.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you, Ms. Mangoba. Looking to the other side of the dais, to the Assembly, are there any questions? Not seeing any questions at this time. I will go to Senator Brooks.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I move that the committee include the local funding utilized by school districts, charter schools, and university schools for profoundly gifted pupils for special education as a separate tier in the pupil-centered funding plan, which would reduce the statewide base per pupil funding in each year of the 21-23 biennium and allocate this funding back to each school district, charter school, and university schools for profoundly gifted pupils on a monthly basis based on the annual budgeted amount.
I second the motion.
I have a motion by Senator Brooks, a second by Vice Chair Monroe Moreno. Are there any other questions or comments on the motion at this time? Not seeing any. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Any in opposition? Hearing no opposition, passes unanimously of all the members present. Ms. Mangoba, we can proceed.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The methodology utilized in the model provided to fiscal staff balances the school district and charter schools hold harmless amounts by modifying only the adjusted base for pupil funding. However, effective July 1st, 2021, NRS 387.1214 contemplates a proportional reduction be made in the base and weighted funding if money contained in the state education fund decreases from the preceding fiscal year. Fiscal staff requests authority to modify the model to balance the school district and charter schools hold harmless amounts consistent with NRS 387.1214. Consistent with current practice, the model further evaluates eligibility for hold harmless at an individual charter school level, which differs from the evaluation of hold harmless for school districts that are evaluated for hold harmless eligibility at the school district level. As a result, there are two different methodologies to determine eligibility for hold harmless for charter schools and school districts. In that regard, the money committees may wish to evaluate hold harmless eligibility for charter schools based on the same methodology applied to school districts, which would involve reflecting all charter schools as a single group in the model for determining their eligibility for hold harmless. Do the money committees wish to approve applying the methodology in evaluating hold harmless eligibility currently used for school districts by treating all charter schools as one group as opposed to individual charter schools? In addition, do the money committees wish to provide fiscal staff with authority to balance the model related to hold harmless consistent with NRS 387.1214? And Madam Chair, we'll be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you very much. Committee members, are there any questions? Senator Hammond.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I guess the only question I have, when you say all charters, I just wanted to make sure I understood it was very clear that it didn't matter the LEA. It didn't matter if it was a district charter or the charter authority. It's all charters, correct?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Through you to Senator Hammond. The school district charter schools are not separated out as a separate charter school in the evaluation of the hold harmless. They're lumped in within the school district. So they're not part of this disparity in how we're evaluating the hold harmless between the charter schools. It's the charter schools that would be sponsored by the State Public Charter School Authority, which are individually identified in the pupil-centered funding model. Charter schools sponsored by the school districts, and Ms. Mangoba is going to verify that I'm speaking the correct information here.
No, I think it's according to District 100 Academy of Excellence. That is a
Okay, I stand corrected that in the model that all charter schools, regardless of sponsors, are separated. And this proposal would, to align the hold harmless evaluation to the same school district level as a combined level for charter schools, does include the charter school sponsored by school district.
Senator Hammond gave me a thumbs up. Moving on to Senator Severs-Gansert.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm not sure exactly how that would work because I'm not sure what those numbers would look like intuitively. Charter schools are very unique in that there's very few that are grouped together that have a management organization that's the same. They're sort of one-offs, at least the ones in Washoe County. Very few of them are centralized as far as management. And so I guess I have a hard time making a decision like this when I don't really know what those numbers mean because if you're a charter school in Fallon, your hold harmless is quite a bit different than maybe a charter school in Las Vegas or a charter school in Reno. So can you tell me do you expect to lump them together, figure out what a hold harmless is, and then they are supposed to jointly redistribute funds, or if we do it this way versus going school by school, recognizing the money that they've received in the past per pupil versus the money they'll potentially receive in the future individually?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Through you to Senator Severs-Gansert. This hold harmless, it's kind of, it gets confusing when we use the term hold harmless broadly and it applies to multiple decision points. The decision point here that we're talking about is in the evaluation in the pupil-centered funding plan model of whether or not a charter school, based on, again, as you recall, the committee has approved that the evaluation of hold harmless of whether or not a school district or a charter school would be on the pupil-centered funding plan, if they would gain funding on a per pupil basis on the pupil-centered funding plan, or if they would lose funding on the pupil-centered funding plan. The comparison is between the funding that the school district or charter school received in 2020 on a per pupil basis with the new funding that a school district or charter school will receive on the pupil-centered funding plan. That comparison is done at a school district level, and then based on past practice or current practice in evaluating hold harmless for enrollment changes, hold harmless is evaluated at an individual school district level. That provides an additional advantage for the charter schools in terms of their changes in funding, because it's easier for them to, it's not apples to apples in terms of a school district, which is much larger and may have 300 or 400 schools, has to meet a certain threshold before they would rise to hold harmless level, as opposed to the charter schools. And so this proposal would basically sum all charter schools, the funding they would receive on a pupil-centered funding plan, and compare it to the funding they received in total in 2020. And at that point, you would say, hey, you received more on the pupil-centered funding plan. Charter schools are on the pupil-centered funding plan, or if they received less funding on the pupil-centered funding plan, then they would be on the hold harmless at a per pupil level. Now, the per pupil level is by individual school district.
Thank you.
Based on the funding they received in 2020, if they were on that hold harmless.
Well, that helps me, because if it's still going back to per pupil hold harmless or at an individual school, that helps. And so I guess I'm not, and maybe that's all I need to know, because when you lump them together, maybe that's just for your calculation purposes, so you don't have to break them into a lot of little pieces. But as long as it's per pupil individually, I think that's helpful. Thank you.
With that,
Madam Chair, may I
yes, Ms. Waller, go ahead.
statement? So the decision point of whether or not the charter schools would be on the new formula or remain on the old formula hold harmless, the 2020 amount, is made at the combined charter school level, as though they were an 18th school district. Once that determination of the funding that they would receive in total is made, and they would be on the pupil-centered funding plan, then all charter schools will be on the pupil-centered funding plan, and then the per pupil amount that they would receive under the pupil-centered funding plan would be what they would be paid on their enrollment that they would have in fiscal year 22 and 23. If the evaluation in the model of the pupil-centered funding plan shows that they would, as a combined group, all charter schools similar to an 18-6 school district, would receive less funding than on the pupil-centered funding plan, then they would be on the hold harmless per pupil amount, and all charter schools would be receive their per pupil that they would be entitled to on the 2020 per pupil hold harmless level. So it's the evaluation of whether or not as a group they stay on the pupil-centered funding or on the 2020 hold harmless, or if they move over to the pupil-centered funding plan, and then once they are identified as the hold harmless provision of the new model, they would all be paid individually their per pupil amount that's determined according to the calculations in the model. I would point out that because the committee has approved the evaluation of the 2020 hold harmless amounts on a per pupil basis, this is just to determine the rate that they will receive on a per pupil basis. Now, if a charter school is deemed to be on the pupil-centered funding plan and they receive a certain amount per pupil, and let's say their enrollment drops, then they would this concept would also apply, that we would look at the charter schools combined in a year and say if their enrollment dropped greater than 5%, then they would be eligible to be to count their students from the prior year, and then they would be paid accordingly. And that's similar to the process that's used currently for the school districts in evaluating hold harmless for enrollment drops.
And as Ms. Waller just alluded to, the 5% hold harmless that is in statute is still there. So that backstop is there to protect districts that, with that variation, it cannot fluctuate past that 5%. And if it does, then they get to fall back to the previous year to be able to address that issue. So, Assemblywoman Tolles.
Thank you, Chair. And I do appreciate this is giving me a little bit more comfort that we keep coming back to each charter school will get the amount hold harmless on the individual school level. I guess I'm still just trying to wrap my head functionally around how this is distributed, because we have a school district with their own CFO and with their budget, and they function in a way that makes sense to be able to distribute to each of the schools, whereas the charter schools are unique. Has the Charter School Authority, do they have the capacity to do this, and were they sort of brought into this discussion to confirm they have the capacity to then distribute out this way?
Thank you, Madam Chair, to you, to Assemblywoman Toll. So that's a great question, and for clarification, this is for the evaluation in the pupil-centered funding plan of which per pupil rate that school districts or charter schools would receive as we transition to the full implementation of the pupil-centered funding plan. Once they know what their per pupil rate is, the Department of Education will continue to pay the school districts individually for their count of enrollment and the dollars that they're entitled to for their adjusted base per pupil, their English learner populations, at-risk gate, so they will continue to process the payments directly to those charter schools. This is not a payment consolidation. This is just the evaluation at a consolidated 18th district level, and then determining which plan you are on, and then proceeding forward as such, with the model spitting out the dollars that each charter school would then be eligible to receive in that school year. And the Department of Education would continue to pay them in the same manner that they're currently being paid.
Senator Kickefer.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I want to make sure I understand the problem we're trying to solve. And it's that districts are evaluated for hold harmless as a unit, and charters are evaluated for hold harmless on a school-by-school basis. And I mean, that's the issue that we're trying to address. Am I understanding that right, Ms. Waller?
Yes, Madam Chair, through you to Senator Kiefer. Yes, that is one of the issues. And the other issue is that in moving to the pupil-centered funding plan model, there have been changes in the way that the funding is allocated to the charter schools. And so if you do the hold harmless on a school-by-school basis, wherein you had under the existing funding formula, online charter schools were eligible to receive the per pupil funding from wherever whatever county their students reside. And so they had a variation of per pupil funding from various counties. And that would be baked in as their hold harmless amount, as opposed to looking at in total, the charter schools and under the pupil-centered funding plan, and as well as what their 2020 funding was received, and then determining which per pupil amount they would be on. So under the new funding formula, the statewide average per pupil is eligible for those online schools. So there's a fundamental shift in how we're funding charter schools as well, included in the transition to the pupil-centered funding plan.
Thank you for that. I wonder if we're at a district level, right? If there will be some schools that individually would probably do well under the new plan versus the old one, but the district as a unit has the ability to manage that influx or reduction of dollars by moving and balancing out their funding for individual schools. Charters don't have that, so there could certainly be a charter that would receive more funding under the pupil-centered funding plan for serving students that are receiving weights, but still be put at a lower level due to the sort of aggregation of the weighted plan, right? And they wouldn't be able to balance it out. There would be no smoothing between the schools, right? Because those schools get funding individually.
The schools do receive funding individually, and again, as we transition to the new funding formula, there is the change in the school district, or excuse me, the charter school will receive the statewide average base per pupil with the NCEI adjustment, as well as now the recently approved attendance area adjustments, and plus any additional funding they would receive from any special student populations. That would be their funding level. That's a bit of a change from the way that the charter schools are funded currently. So it is a policy decision, and again, it would be akin to, as you say, that school districts are evaluated at the school district level, which could include, several hundred schools, whereas a charter school only has a single school information to compare, and so it makes those comparisons sort of disparate under the current methodology.
I appreciate that, Ms. Waller. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think the alternative is just to spend enough money that no one's going to hold harmless.
No.
Nice try.
I've heard that line before, Senator Kiefer. You're not the first one that's tried it this session. So with that, I believe we have a discussion point in front of us at this time. So Senator Brooks?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I move to approve applying the methodology in evaluating hold harmless eligibility currently used for school districts by treating all charter schools as one group as opposed to individual charter schools. In addition, I move to provide fiscal staff with authority to balance the model related to hold harmless consistent with NRS 387.1214.
I will second the motion.
I have a motion from Senator Brooks and a second from Vice Chair Monroe Moreno. Are there any questions or comments on the motion? The citation is the 5% backstop hold harmless that was referred to earlier, just to make sure everybody's aware. Seeing no other questions or comments, all of those in support, please.
Madam Chair?
I'm sorry, did I miss something?
If we may, we just wanted to clarify that the NRS citation here is not in reference to that 5%.
Oh, thank you.
This is in reference to the new people-centered funding plan, where
Okay.
any decreases of revenue should be proportionally reduced between the base and the weight.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. I stand corrected, and it won't be the last time in the next week that that will happen. So with that, committee members, that citation is corrected. Any other questions or comments? Seeing none, all those in favor, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Any in opposition? Hearing no opposition, passes unanimously of the members present. Ms. Mangoba, if you'd like to proceed.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It should be noted the model provided to fiscal staff includes incremental increases to weighted funding until the targeted weighted funding is achieved. However, since projected funding in fiscal year 22 is lower than the fiscal year 20 funding levels, it appears the incremental increase should be applied to the statewide base per pupil amount before weights are incrementally increased in fiscal year 22. And accordingly, the money committees may wish to eliminate the incremental increase to weighted funding in fiscal year 22 and instead increase the statewide base per pupil funding by that remaining funding. Do the money committees wish to eliminate the incremental increase to weighted funding in fiscal year 22 and instead increase the statewide base per pupil funding using the remaining funding?
So with that committee, are there any questions? I know there's been a lot of conversations about making sure that we get as many dollars back into the base as possible. It's been an ongoing conversation. I know at one time there was discussion points about if there was any leftover money, where would it go? But the way the model is supposed to work, it should balance out. There shouldn't be any extra money. The money should be going back into the base, but we think there's still a couple of glitches there. So that's the inclination of the committee was basically to make sure that everything is built on the base. And the more we do to build that up, the better it'll flow and stand up on its own for the first year and run on its own after that. So this is about building up the base. Getting a head nod from Senator Kieckeffer. Other nods at the other end on the assembly side. Any other questions or comments? Seeing none, Senator Brooks.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I move that we eliminate the incremental increase to weighted funding in fiscal year 2022 and instead increase the statewide base per pupil funding using the remaining funding.
I second the motion.
I have a motion from Senator Brooks, a second from Vice Chair Monroe Moreno. Any other questions or conversations on the motion? Seeing none. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Any in opposition? Hearing no opposition, passes unanimously of all the members that are present. Ms. Mangoba, we can proceed.
Thank you, Madam Chair. While many K-12 categorical grant programs that were reduced during the 31st special session were recommended for restoration in the executive budget, the base budget continues funding reductions of $501,775 in each year for the English Learner Program and $1.8 million in each year for the Victory Schools program compared to the amount approved by the 2019 legislature. Given the transition to the pupil-centered funding plan, the money committees may wish to restore funding for the additional support of English learners and at-risk pupils to the fiscal year 20 legislatively approved funding level. Do the money committees wish to restore the funding reduced during the 31st special session for English learners and at-risk pupils to the fiscal year 20 legislatively approved funding level, which would require general fund appropriations of $2.3 million in each year of the 2021-23 biennium to the state education funding account?
Committee members, any conversation? I know that during the special session, when we had these conversations, I can remember sitting in this actual room with my caucus and the concerns that they shared with us and the commitment that we all made to do whatever we could to bring these programs back because they are so significant for those at-risk pupils. So I'm very happy to see this encapsulated in our discussion points. Senator Severs-Gansert.
Thank you, Chair. I was wondering, since these cuts were directly related to COVID, could these be restored using ARP funds instead of general funds?
For the record, Jamie Mangoba, federal funds are not included in the pupil-centered funding plan, and it's kept outside of the model. Go ahead, Joe.
Thank you. Is that a policy decision, though? Is that a policy decision? Because that's how we're running it. Because we have restored positions, not in K-12, but we restored other positions using the ARP funds. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Julie Waller for the record. So the federal dollars to which you reference are the one-time dollars, and these would be the weighted funding that would be run through the model. And current law related to SB 543 and the Pupil-Centered Funding Plan does not run any federal dollars through the model. The funding formula is through the funding sources that are directed to the state education funding account, and they do not include federal dollars.
Senator Brooks.
Senator Severs-Gansert, I had similar questions, and so you're referring to the ARP funding, right? That's set aside for lost revenue and is flexible funding that can be used to backfill lost things caused by lost revenue. And I think that there's still some conversation whether or not that's allowable, but I would advocate for that myself, and that's one of the things that we've identified, I think, as a direct link to lost revenue.
Thank you. And I'm thinking along the same lines, and I think we have to be able to resolve this model and what the dollars are, and there may be opportunities to trade dollars after we balance everything. So we should track it. Thank you.
Madam Majority Leader, did you have a question?
Not so much a question, just part of that. I think that I don't want anyone to think that we haven't thought or that there hasn't been conversations slicing and dicing it 500 different ways about how to make those dollars work and where we can apply them. I think what we want to do, though, is kind of make sure that we're being kind of just sufficiently cautious because we have staff reading over guidance at the same time as they're working to produce 185-page closing budgets for us. So I think everything will sort out in time. I know that we're under the crunch with the calendar we have, but I think it is all hands on deck to kind of figure out how we piece the jigsaw puzzle to go. And we know we're not at a conversation that's done yet, right? We're just waiting for everyone else to catch up to our brilliant thinking of how we're going to use all that money.
Thank you, Madam Majority Leader. And again, we don't have the money yet. So with that, any other questions or comments at this time? Not seeing any. Senator Brooks?
Thank you. I move to restore the funding. I move that we restore the funding reduced during the 31st special session for English learners and at-risk pupils to the fiscal year 2020 legislatively approved funding level, which would require general fund appropriations of $2.3 million in each year of the 2021-23 biennium to the state education funding account.
I'll second the motion.
I have a motion from Senator Brooks, a second from Ms. Monroe Moreno. Any questions or comments on the motion? Not seeing any. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Any in opposition? Hearing no opposition, passes unanimously of the members present. Moving on to the next item, Ms. Mangova.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The next budget is the new Nevada Education Funding Plan budget account 2677. The subcommittee recommended approval of the governor's recommendation to restore and transfer general fund appropriations of $69.9 million in each year of the 2021-23 biennium and projected interest earnings of $22,044 in each year from the new Nevada Education Funding Plan budget to the state education funding account. Of this total, 50% will be allocated to fund the English learner weight, and 50% will be allocated to fund the at-risk weight in the pupil-centered funding plan. The next budget is the Instruction in Financial Literacy budget account 2620. The Instruction in Financial Literacy budget had a closing difference related to the governor's recommendation to transfer the Instruction in Financial Literacy program funding, including general fund appropriation of $750,000 in each year of the 2021-23 biennium from the Instruction in Financial Literacy budget to the state education funding account. The Senate members of the subcommittee recommended approval of the governor's recommendation, while the Assembly members of the subcommittee recommended not approving the governor's recommendation. The recommendation to transfer the Instruction in Financial Literacy program funding to the new state education funding account is part of the governor's recommendation to implement the pupil-centered funding plan. It should be noted that the recommendation would eliminate the funding in the Instruction in Financial Literacy budget, and Senate Bill 439 also proposes to eliminate the account for instruction in financial literacy in statute. Do the money committees wish to approve transferring the Instruction in Financial Literacy program funding to the new state education funding account in the 2021-23 biennium, thereby eliminating the funding in this budget?
Are there any questions or comments from the committee at this time? The Assembly is comfortable in moving forward with this provision. Now, originally, there were some issues, but those have been resolved, so the Assembly is comfortable in moving forward at this time. No questions or comments? No? Everybody's got their head down, moving forward. All right, with that, Senator Brooks.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I move that we approve transferring the Instruction and Financial Literacy Program funding to the new state education funding account in the 21-23 biennium, thereby eliminating the funding in this budget.
I'll second the motion.
I have a motion from Senator Brooks, a second from Vice Chair Monroe Moreno. Any other questions or comments on the motion? Seeing none, all those in favor, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Any in opposition? Hearing no opposition, passes unanimously of all the members present. Moving on to the next item, the distributive school account. Ms. Mangova.
Thank you, Madam Chair. As you've indicated, the next budget is the distributive school account, budget account 2610. The subcommittee recommended approval of general fund reductions of $78 million in each year of the 2021-23 biennium for the class size reduction program, and transferring general fund appropriations of $77.5 million in fiscal year 22 and $81 million in fiscal year 23 associated with the class size reduction program from the distributive school account budget to the new state education funding account budget to support the implementation of the pupil-centered funding plan. The subcommittee recommended approval of the governor's recommendations for general fund appropriations of $28.6 million in fiscal year 22 and $33.6 million in fiscal year 23 to provide a funding enhancement for the Nevada Plan formula funding based on projected revenue from the 10% excise tax on the retail sales of recreational marijuana products. The subcommittee recommended approval of the governor's recommendation for general fund appropriations of $223.2 million in fiscal year 22 and $228.8 million in fiscal year 23 to support the education of pupils with disabilities and providing this funding outside of the pupil-centered funding plan, contingent upon passage of Senate Bill 439 or other enabling legislation. The subcommittee also recommended approval of the governor's recommendation for general fund appropriations of $1.5 million in each year of the 2021-23 biennium to provide funding for pupils with disabilities who exceed the 13% funding cap, and providing this funding outside of the pupil-centered funding plan, contingent upon passage of Senate Bill 439 or other enabling legislation. The subcommittee further recommended excluding special education pupils who belong to other weighted pupil categories from receiving other weighted funding, and transferring all funding associated with pupils and disabilities to the contingency account for special education services budget, and renaming that budget as the account for state special education services. To implement the pupil-centered funding plan, the subcommittee recommended approval of the governor's recommendation to transfer the state share of funding for the Nevada Plan Formula funding of $1.378 billion, including general fund appropriations of $830.9 million in fiscal year 22 and $1.324 billion, including general fund appropriation of $702.5 million in fiscal year 23, to the state education funding account budget. The subcommittee also recommended transferring the special transportation funding of $146,630 in fiscal year 22 and $147,630 in fiscal year 23 for Native American pupils to the state education fund, and providing this funding as separate auxiliary funding in the pupil-centered funding plan, as well as transferring the National School Lunch Program state match funding of $588,732 in each year of the 2021-23 biennium to the Department of Agriculture's Nutrition Education Programs budget. The subcommittee also recommended enabling legislation be drafted and included in the K-12 funding bill to implement these transfers. With these transfers, the subcommittee recommended retiring the distributive school account budget at the end of fiscal year 21, as the pupil-centered funding plan would be initially implemented. The next budget on page 15 is the Other State Education Programs, budget account 2699. The subcommittee recommended approval of general fund appropriations totaling $48.9 million in each year of the 2021-23 biennium to restore funding for 10 K-12 categorical grant programs, including the Read by Grade 3, Underperforming Turnaround Schools, College and Career Readiness, Gifted and Talented Education, Special Elementary Counseling, College and Career Ready Diplomas, Adult High School Diploma, Career and Technical Education, Jobs for America's Graduates, and the Educational Leadership Programs. However, the subcommittee recommended that the restoration of $252,098 in each fiscal year for the Jobs for America's Graduates program in Decision Unit E286 be considered one-time funding to continue a match requirement in the 2021-23 biennium. The subcommittee recommended approval of the governor's recommendation to reduce general fund appropriations by $24.2 million in fiscal year 22 and $24.4 million in fiscal year 23 for the Read by Grade 3, Underperforming Turnaround Schools, College and Career Readiness, and Advanced Placement Examination programs, and general fund reductions totaling $899,014 in each year of the 2021-23 biennium for the Nevada Institute on Teaching and Educator Preparation, Teacher and Nursing National Board Certification Reimbursement, Counselor Certification, and Speech Pathologist Increment programs. As recommended by the governor, the subcommittee recommended approval of the transfer of general fund appropriations of $8.3 million in each fiscal year for the Gifted and Talented Education program in Decision Unit E916, and general fund appropriations totaling $18.7 million in fiscal year 22 and $18.5 million in fiscal year 23 for the Read by Grade 3 program, Advanced Placement program, District Library Grant program, Computer Education Technology program, Special Elementary Counseling, and the College and Career Ready Diploma programs in Decision Unit E947 from the Other State Education Programs budget to the State Education Funding Account budget to support the implementation of the pupil-centered funding plan. The subcommittee further recommended approval of maintaining general fund appropriations totaling $37.4 million in fiscal year 22 and $37.7 million for the public broadcasting, education leadership, jobs for America's graduates, career and technical education, and adult high school diploma programs in the other state education programs budget, and transferring general fund appropriations totaling $1.7 million in fiscal year 22 and $1.3 million in fiscal year 23 for the Vocational Student Organization, Geographic Alliance in Nevada, Education Technology, School Library Media Specialist Salary Increment, National Board Certification Reimbursement, and Counselor Certification and Speech Pathologist Salary Increment grant programs from the other state education programs budget to the state education funding account to support the implementation of the people-centered funding plan. The next budget is the professional development programs. The subcommittee recommended approval of the governor's recommendation to restore the funding for the Great Teaching and Leading Fund and the Peer Assistance and Review Program in the professional development programs budget, totaling $6.2 million in each year of the 2021-23 biennium in the base budget, and general fund reductions of $744,043 in each year of the 2021-23 biennium to reduce funding for the Great Teaching and Leading Fund. The subcommittee further recommended approval to transfer the net funding of $4.2 million for the Great Teaching and Leading Fund and $1.3 million for the Peer Assistance and Review Program from the Professional Development Programs budget to the new state education funding account to support the people-centered funding plan. Finally, the subcommittee recommended including language in the K-12 funding bill or other enabling legislation to eliminate the Great Teaching and Leading Fund from statute. The next budget is the School Remediation Trust Fund, budget account 2615. The subcommittee recommended approval of general fund appropriations of $2.5 million in each year of the 2021-23 biennium to restore funding for the incentives for new or transferred teachers in Title I or underperforming schools program, as recommended by the governor. The subcommittee also recommended a transfer of $2.5 million in each year of the 2021-23 biennium for incentives for new or transferred teachers in Title I or underperforming schools, and base funding of $2.5 million in each year of the 2021-23 biennium for the incentives for new teachers in Title I or underperforming schools to the state education funding account budget to support the implementation of the pupil-centered funding plan. The subcommittee recommended approval of general fund appropriations of $1 million in each year of the 2021-23 biennium to restore funding for the supplemental support block grant and the transfer of this block grant totaling $36.8 million in each year of the 2021-23 biennium to the distributive school account as recommended by the governor. The subcommittee further recommended approval of the governor's recommendation to transfer $82.6 million, which includes $80.9 million in general fund in fiscal year 22 and $82.6 million, which includes $81.1 million in general fund in fiscal year 23 for the English learning program. That includes totaling $49.4 million each year. The Victory Schools program, totaling $23.2 million in each year, and the Nevada Ready 21 Technology program, totaling $10 million in each year, to the state education funding account budget to support the implementation of the pupil-centered funding plan. The next budget is the school safety budget, budget account 2698. The subcommittee recommended approval of the governor's recommendation to restore and reduce funding for the social or other licensed mental health worker program and transfer the net general fund appropriations of $18.3 million in each year of the 2021-23 biennium from the school safety budget to the new state education funding account budget, contingent upon implementation of the pupil-centered funding plan. The subcommittee also recommended approval of the governor's recommendation to restore and reduce funding for the School Resource Police Officer Program and transfer the net general fund appropriations of $4.3 million in each year of the 2021-23 biennium from the school safety budget to the new state education funding account budget, contingent upon implementation of the pupil-centered funding plan. The subcommittee also recommended allowing the department to utilize the base budget general fund appropriations of $201,000 in each year of the 2021-23 biennium to administer school climate service and transferring that funding from the school safety budget to the department's safe and respectful learning budget. The next budget is the bullying prevention account, budget account 2704. The subcommittee recommended approval of the governor's recommendation for general fund appropriations of $45,000 in each year of the 2021-23 biennium to restore funding in the bullying prevention account, as well as the transfer of this funding to the state education funding account budget. The subcommittee also recommended the elimination of the bullying prevention account from statute by including such language in the bill that would revise various provisions related to the pupil-centered funding plan or other enabling legislation. The subcommittee recommended closing the following K-12 education budget as recommended by the governor or as recommended by the governor with minor technical adjustment. The state supplemental school support account, budget account 2617, Teach Nevada Scholarship Program, budget account 2718, incentives for licensed education personnel, budget account 2616, contingency account for special education services, budget account 2619. And Madam Chair, that concludes our the subcommittee closing report.
Thank you very much, Ms. Mangoba. Ms. Waller, I know Mr. Drost is over in a hole somewhere working very, very hard. All three of you have been there for us through this. Thank you for explaining things to all of us 3, 4, 5 times to make sure that we had a thorough understanding of exactly all the moving pieces and parts of what we needed to do this session to address the issues in K-12 education. So, committee members, are there any other questions or comments at this time? It's almost like Christmas Day. You work really, really hard to get everything done, and then you have the vote and it's all over. So, not seeing any questions or comments, I will go to Senator Brooks.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I move that we approve the subcommittee, joint subcommittee on K through 12 and higher education closing report for K through 12 education with the decisions that we've made incorporated in it.
Have a motion?
I will second the motion.
Have a motion from Senator Brooks, a second from Ms. Monroe Moreno. Are there any other questions or comments on the motion at this time? Not seeing any. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Any in opposition? Passes unanimously of the members present. That's a good thing. So with that, that accomplishes our mission for this evening as far as K-12 goes. Just to let folks know, this isn't the last conversation about K-12. There will be another conversation tomorrow morning. This gives us all the decision points that we needed to make the follow-up decisions. So Assembly Ways and Means and Senate Finance will meet again tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. in this room. Immediately following that meeting, Assembly Ways and Means and Assembly Education will go into a joint meeting to discuss the policy bill of pupil-centered funding. So we will be dealing with that, and then I believe Senate Finance has its own agenda immediately following that. So the only thing that we have left before us this evening is public comment. So I would welcome folks to come to the dais. Please introduce yourself, spell your name. Please keep in mind the 2 minutes. Thank you very much.
Hello, and thank you, Committee Chair Brooks and Chairwoman Carlton. For the record, my name is Hava Ahmed, Hawah-Ahmad, and I'm here representing the Clark County Education Association. CCEA represents over 18,000 licensed educators and is the largest independent teachers union in the country. We engage in bipartisan advocacy to advance public education in Nevada. CCEA would like to thank this committee for your hard work on the People-Centered Funding Plan. As we transition to the PCFP, CCEA encourages this body to review the Commission on School Funding's April 23, 2021 report that suggests 4 plans to gradually increase revenue to put our students first and fund education in Nevada. CCEA understands that to pass new revenue to fund the PCFP, we need a bipartisan effort led by the governor, and we are cautiously optimistic that that can still happen. Most importantly, CCEA believes that the ARP funds should and can and should be utilized to invest in the hardest hit communities by this pandemic, specifically our students. However, one-time funding is not enough. We also need new revenue that is ongoing to fund our K-12 education system. This can happen this session, but we need your help. Please join us in helping to support our educators and, most importantly, to support our students. CCEA stands ready to work with the legislature, the governor, gaming, and mining to find a solution. Thank you so much and have a good evening.
Thank you, chairs and committee members. My name is Brian Rippett, B-R-I-A-N-R-I-P-P-E-T. I'm a chemistry and physics teacher from Douglas County, currently serving as the president of the Nevada State Education Association. As Chair Carlton noted at the outset of the meeting and just also a few moments ago, this is not the last conversation we're having on education or education funding, thankfully. And this gives me hope that students and communities still have a chance to have their educational needs met here in Nevada in the next biennium. The restoration of cuts that were made in the 31st special session is a good start. This fulfills promises that many of you made last summer. Yet still to be addressed are the recommendations of the Commission on School Funding to make significant investments in our students in order to get Nevada out of 48th place and up to adequate within the decade. I trust that you will continue to do the necessary work and keep that promise as well. Thank you so much for your time.
Good evening, committee members. My name is Andrea DiMichele. I am a school counselor at Proctor R. Hug High School in Washoe County School District and the NSEA Secretary-Treasurer. I am very concerned about SB 439 and the new school funding formula. Hug High School is a victory-funded school, and we received an additional $1.6 million in funding. It is imperative that we keep victory funding in its current form of directly helping the most at-risk schools. This extra money we received from Victory allowed us to hire more staff, improve academic interventions, and eliminate barriers to education. We hired 25 new staff members, including teachers, counselors, and educational support staff. The extra counselor brought my caseload down to 250, which is also in line with the recommended national counselor ratio of 250 to 1 for student counselor to student. In the past, my caseload has been up to 500. This smaller caseload has allowed me to give individual attention to my students and families to help them graduate, career, and college ready. In addition, the extra funding means our students do not have to pay fees for core classes. We cover the cost of AP exams to help eliminate those barriers to a rigorous curriculum. We also purchase materials for our performing arts programs. This year, we were able to buy extra technology, including hotspots for our students for distance learning. Victory funds also help improve instructional support by providing supplies and stipends to teachers to meet their needs in the classroom. Overall, Victory funds help to lower chronic absenteeism and improve the school's average daily attendance and graduation rates. Since the induction of Victory funds, the graduation rate at Hug High School has increased from 50% to 80%. The extra funds allow the staff to focus on the safety and social emotional learning needs of our students. With the removal of Victory grant funding from school budgets, all of the extra time and effort that my school has spent to improve academic achievement will be lost. Not to mention 25 staff members, a dean, a behavior specialist, 6 intervention preventionists, 3 campus monitors, 3 bilingual clerks, 1 IT tech, and 10 teachers had to find new jobs because of the loss of our school's Victory funds. My students deserve the same educational opportunities as other students in more affluent zip codes.
Hello, my name is Selena LaRue Hatch, L-A space R-U-E-H-A-T-C-H. I made the early morning drive on Saturday to tell you a little bit about my class, and I'm here on a school night to tell you a little bit more. And just so you know, educators usually go to bed around 9, so this is a big commitment, and I think it shows how critical these issues are. And so I want to tell you a little more about my class. I have textbooks right now that talk about our newly elected president, George W. Bush. And they talk about this new thing called the internet. And my geography class, we have to draw in the borders of countries that have been created since 2002. I asked my students this week if they're excited to come back to normal school next year, and many of them said no, because they don't want to be on the floor again. They don't want to be in a classroom of 40 again. They felt like they've gotten attention this year that they haven't gotten because of our overcrowding. And so I just wanted to implore you to help us be better than 48th. You'll notice a lot of us are wearing our 48 stickers because we are better than 48. Our students are better than 48, and they deserve to be treated as such. They're better than sitting on the floor, better than having outdated textbooks, better than crowded classes where they can't get more than 6 minutes of attention a week. And I can say that the new funding plan can be touted as this great new thing that will improve education, but a new funding plan with no new funding is doomed to fail. And I'm asking you to invest. If you believe in this plan, invest in it. Start with new revenue. Start with AJR 1. Allow Nevadans to have a vote, to have a say on this bill, and let us help you fix our educational crisis. Tomorrow, I hear that you're going to be talking a little further about education. I will be in the classroom, so I won't be here with you tomorrow. But I hope that we see investment in education. I hope we see restoration of the cuts that have been made. And I hope that you will invest in our students so we are better than 48th. Thank you.
Madam Chair, Chris Daly, Nevada State Education Association, the voice of Nevada educators for over 120 years. So for 2 years, I think you all know this by now, NSCA has consistently expressed policy concerns with the new funding plan passed as SB 543 last session. We've talked about the lack of educator voice, the lack of new revenue, a watering down of Zoom and Victory schools, freezing and squeezing school district budgets, and an undoing of the rules of collective bargaining that will slant things entirely in the favor of employers. We've also talked about how Nevada ranks 48th among the states in education funding, despite efforts of many of you in this room over the last several sessions. Yet the new funding plan contains no new funding. And it's been mentioned that the Funding Commission has recommended a 10-year plan for Nevada to increase education funding by $2 billion per year. These recommendations so far have not been thoroughly vetted. They're certainly not included in SB 439, the 543 trailer bill. It's clear, though, that the legislature's intent on pulling the trigger on the new funding plan. And in doing so, NSCA would strongly encourage you to address just 3 issues in order to make sure that it works for all Nevada educators and students. First, grandfather existing Zoom and Victory schools. You heard from one Victory school teacher, Andrea Michelli, this evening. Zoom and Victory schools currently are being told that they're looking at budget cuts for their school district budget for the next year based on the new funding plan. That's not a funding plan for equity when Zoom and Victory schools are necessarily in our lowest income communities, serving the highest percentage of English learners and at-risk students. Second, we've talked about holding school districts truly harmless, and we do appreciate the move made to use the per pupil amount as opposed to the whole dollar amount, but you still have increases in cost of doing business. And if you take a look at scenario A in your documents today, you have 14 school districts that will be in hold harmless for at least 2 years. I haven't seen the math or the additional spreadsheets or the tabs to know how long those school districts will be under this freeze. But if you allow them the opportunity to pay those increased utility costs, to pay those increased healthcare costs or whatever those fixed costs that go up every year are, they won't be constricted in terms of their budgets in out years. And then finally, the anti-union ending fund language balance. We talk a lot in policy committees about recruiting and retaining teachers and, the pipeline. If you take away the ability for education unions to negotiate, even 2% raises at the bargaining table, it's just going to make the teacher shortage in that pipeline that much worse. A couple of cuts that are outstanding: class size reduction and read by 3. We've discussed these. We are hopeful that you're able to fix those important line items in the budget in the coming days, and we appreciate all of your work and attention to this budget. Thank you.
Good evening, assembled members of the Joint Finance Committees and the chairs. My name is Sarah Adler with Silver State Government Relations, tonight representing the Charter School Association of Nevada. First, we want to recognize and thank you for the months and months of hard work that you and your staff have done to get to the point that you made decisions tonight, starting back with the special sessions and the cuts that you had to make. That's our first thanks. Second, we deeply and sincerely appreciate including charter schools in the adjustment by attendance area. That is really an enormous move to equity, and we deeply appreciate that. Second, we admit some confusion about the per pupil and hold harmless decisions tonight, and we are hopeful and confident that some communication can happen between and among you, the SPCSA, and your fiscal staff to clarify that issue, because the SPCSA has some LEA functions, but is not in itself a district able to redistribute money at a charter school basis. Some schools, initial calculations say to us that some schools will not in fact be held harmless, but we are hopeful for some additional clarity and work on that. Simply, thank you very much.
Is there anyone present wishing to make public comment at this time? Not seeing anyone else in the room coming forward, we will go ahead and open it up to Zoom and broadcast. Broadcast services, do we have anyone on the phone line wishing to make public comment this evening?
Anyone wishing to make public comment, please press star 9 now to take your place in the queue. Caller with the last 3 digits, 402. Please slowly state and spell your name for the record. You will have 2 minutes and may begin.
Good evening. My name is Terry Schuman, S-H-U-M-A-N, and I'm currently a support professional in Clark County. It's been brought to my attention several times that our state song is Home Means Nevada. A home, a place where you can raise your kids, make sure they are safe, and give them a good education. Your kids, our students, deserve the very best education we can provide. This is the reason why for years our educators have flocked to Carson City to ask the legislature, to beg, to plead for more money, yet instead of getting help, they are given budget cuts, programs such as Read by Grade 3 cuts, refusals to lower classroom sizes, and refusals to place AGR 1 on the ballot so our people can vote for it. Y'all are so concerned about the minors leaving the state if you pass taxes. But let me ask you one question. When is the last time your child spent a day with a minor? My guess is probably never. Yet our educators spend almost as much time with your children as you do. We teach them every single day how to read, write, and do arithmetic. Yet we have to go out and buy our own supplies. Our classes are so large that we have students sitting on the floor and many who are without books. Many of our support professionals are even below or at the poverty line. I'm asking you point blank, why do you insist on cheating your children when it comes to their education? I started this conversation by bringing up our state song, Home Means Nevada. But if we cannot get the revenue to fund our schools, our parents may start to mean our song may, if we cannot continue to get the revenue our schools need, we may start to mean something besides Nevada being their home. Our parents are watching. They may start to consider Arizona, Michigan, Tennessee, or even Rhode Island for their place to get a good education. Please allow AGR 1 to be placed on the ballot. Please fund our schools. Please do not allow any more budget cuts. We want the best for your children as much as you do. Thank you.
Broadcast Services, next caller, please.
Chair, the public comment line is open and working. However, we have no more callers at this time.
Thank you very much, Broadcast Services, for being with us this evening and helping us through this meeting. Committee members, I believe our tasks for this evening are complete. I will see everyone at 9 a.m. sharp in this room. Thank you all very much. We are adjourned.